Thank you for continue with us. As I say, this is the interesting part. We've discussed or highlighted some of the problems, and in this session, we're going to start looking at how we actually move things forward, which is challenging. These are not new problems. These have been around since the 50s, 60s, really, until we started putting cars in our streets on a large scale. And I'm delighted to hand over to Robert Weetman and Anne Docherty, who will take us through some of the work they've been doing at street level and what they're seeing.
Morning, everybody. Stuart, can you just nod that you can hear me fine?
I can hear you, Robert.
Hi, I'm Robert Weetman. I am the technical coordinator for Scotland for Living Streets. For anybody who can't see me, I'm white, tall, able-bodied. I'm a man in my 50s. And for anybody who can't hear me, I have an accent which doesn't belong anywhere in Britain. I'm always from somewhere else. My slides that I'll share in a moment back up what I'm saying, but you don't necessarily have to watch them. I do have some photographs which should help. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, Stuart, again, can you just nod that you can see that screen?
Yes,
thank you.
I can see it.
We're looking. One of the jobs I do is to look at streets to try to assess what they're like for pedestrians, and I want to kind of provide some of the lessons from that work to you. The starting lesson really is that it's not obvious to know what it is that we have to look for when we're assessing the quality of streets for pedestrians. It feels like it should be obvious, but I'm not sure it is. We might think, it's tempting to think of the really obvious things that I should be out assessing. So here are some obvious things on this slide. I should be looking to see, where are surfaces bad? Where is there not been enough maintenance and there are potholes and broken paving slabs and so on? Obviously, I should look for those things. Where are there a lack of dropped curbs? Where have we got dropped curbs? Where are they lacking? Again, that's obviously an incredibly important thing to look for. Where have we got cars parked on the pavements? Again, really, that creates really big problems for people. I definitely should be assessing that. And where are there not enough crossings, not enough, crossings with traffic lights, signalised crossings where you can press a button and get to cross the road safely? All of those things are incredibly important. But here's the thing: we already know that those are problems everywhere. We know that there are bad surfaces everywhere. We know there are lack of dropped curbs. We know that pavement parking is a problem in a lot of places, and we know that there aren't enough crossings. So if we already know that, can I add more? If I'm assessing streets, can I add more than just listing all of those problems? Local authorities, councils already know that they have those problems. So can I add more? When I go and assess an area for what it's like for pedestrians, can I add some more value than just listing all of those problems that we kind of already know are there? And I think I can. So here's a question I like to think about when I'm looking at the quality of streets for pedestrians. Our society has been focused for 60 or 80 years on building towns and cities and streets which facilitate motor vehicle movement and motor vehicle flow and parking. So after 60 or 80 years, what's that created for us from the perspective of pedestrians? What is it that we could, in those slideshows earlier on, what is it that we're seeing that's just that 80 years worth of changing environment with a focus on motor vehicle use? What's that actually created for us? Or another way to ask the same question, if you like, if we made the surface of every single pavement perfectly smooth, and if we added dropped curbs at every road junction that we've currently got, and if, let's say, we doubled the number of signalised crossings with traffic lights, would that mean that we then had good conditions for pedestrians? Because if that's all we're asking for, is that all it's going to take? And I think, from my work, very clearly, that's not going to provide us with good conditions. It would be better. smooth surfaces and dropped curbs and more signalized crossings would be better, but it wouldn't be good. Those things we've been seeing in those images this morning, this wouldn't fix it. So if we know that, then here's a really difficult question. This is actually a really difficult question. What do we actually want? What would good look like? I'm going to share a few photographs of what it is that I've seen, what it is that I see that is, the answer to this question. What is it that we've got after 60 to 80 years focused on vehicle flow and vehicle parking and vehicle movement? So we have, as we know, poor surfaces. We have really poor surfaces. It's incredibly difficult to take a photograph that really shows this, but we have surfaces that are incredibly difficult for many, many people to negotiate. We have a lack of dropped curbs. We have places like this where this is just that nobody drives across this anymore. But when the wall was put up, nobody thought to fill in the gap. We still have to step down onto what used to be an access lane to the left, but no longer is an access lane to the left. But we still have a full-size dropped curbs there. The more I've looked at our streets, the more I realise that we have a severe lack of dropped curbs. Most of us have got used to seeing dropped curbs in city centre locations, shopping streets. But when you venture out into the residential areas around our cities, you realise that actually most of our streets don't have dropped curbs on them. They are actually still an unusual feature. And where we do have dropped curbs, often they're of a really poor quality. So here's a photograph of a dropped curb, which when you look at it, the slope points people who go down that dropped curb towards what effectively is almost a dual carriageway road at this point. The slope is pointing people onto the main road, and this is very, very common. I have a second view of the same crossing, which when you look at it also is designed for people to come sweeping in off the main road without really having to slow down. So we have dropped curbs to allow somebody to cross here, but it's at a terrible crossing point, which is designed really around the idea that we want to get people flowing off the main road as quickly as possible. Then we have poor quality of pavements, of footways. Again, very difficult to take a photograph of, but this pavement is sloping really quite severely, and that makes it very difficult for people using a wheelchair. It makes it very difficult for anybody who's walking is less steady. And that's been put there in order to make it easy for people to drive into a private driveway. It seems much easier to get this done to our streets than it does to add dropped curbs for people to cross at places they want to cross. And we have whole streets where actually most of the pavement is on an angle, sloping. Here's one, and this is a photograph of one, and I've highlighted in red there, rather roughly, all of the sections of pavement which slope in order to make it easy for people to drive into their private driveways. And it's most of the pavement is sloping. That's very difficult also, for even for able-bodied people when it's icy or slippery. And we have pavements and areas which are now completely dominated by parked vehicles on pedestrian space. There are two photographs here. One shows a street where the carriageway is completely clear, but people have parked on both sides of the road right up onto the pavements. There is still some pavement left, but it's quite narrow. And a second photograph where all of the vehicles are end on and blocking a good portion of the pavement. So that's just a physical barrier on the pavement, but we also have physical barriers and just that sense of domination on the carriageway. This is a photograph of somebody using a mobility scooter who's having to squeeze between two vehicles in order to get anywhere near being able to see if it's possible to cross the street. And this is at an obvious point where it's clear that she is likely to want to cross the street. We have major roads which have a real lack of signalised crossings with traffic lights, and large stretches of where to get anywhere you have to walk a long way to meet a crossing that you can use. Of course, we've become used to accepting that most people don't bother walking to the crossings. On many of these roads, it's a habitual part of our design to expect that most pedestrians will scurry across at places which aren't particularly safe, at risk to themselves, and it's become accepted as part of our design that that's how we design our cities. We expect that most people will scurry across, and that's how our cities work. And we have what I call middle status roads. And these middle status roads are everywhere. When you look for them, actually, you realize that most roads are middle status roads. And what I mean by a middle status road is one which isn't a big enough road to have lots of traffic lights on it, signalized crossing where you can press a button to cross. And it's not a small enough road that you would really regard it as a quiet residential street that you could amble across the carriageway in a relaxed way. It sits between those two things. And we have lots and lots of these. They're all over the place when you start looking for them. And we've come to assume that that's just normal. That's what we have to have. Our system surely would break down if we didn't have these. But that's not true. There are other countries, and the Netherlands is the one that stands out, where they have intentionally set out for the last 50 years or something to design these roads out of existence to make sure that roads are either quiet roads that you can amble across, or they're recognized to be main roads where we need to have proper support for pedestrians to cross. So these middle status roads do not need to exist. It is possible to have a working transport system without these roads, without these middle status roads. And we have a situation where every junction in our city is, in our cities and in our towns and in our rural areas as well. Every junction is designed for vehicle flow. Every junction is designed to try to keep speeds up and to try to keep vehicles moving, even at the, very much at the expense of what it's like as a pedestrian to try to cross. This photograph here looks very normal, but it's actually horrific. This is a fairly main road on the left, and the junction is designed so people can smoothly come in off that main road, and we are all expected to cross here. And the tactile paving indicates that here's a place to cross. But this makes no sense when you start studying this junction. There are bins and parked vehicles on both sides of the side street, and it would be very easy to narrow the entrance to this side street without really having any major effect on use of the side street by vehicles. The only thing it might affect is the way that people drive in off the main road. It would mean that people would have to slow down before they turn in off the side road. But that seems appropriate. If we're going to have cities which are designed for, and towns which are designed for, well, we've said we're going to prioritize pedestrians. That's what we need. We need to be prioritizing that over the idea of making sure that we keep the traffic speeds up. And it's a long way to anywhere, often. Many of the places that I study, it turns out the closest decent sized shop or supermarket can be 2 or 3 kilometers away. And often through, those supermarkets, those major shops, those major facilities often sit between communities now, rather than in the center of communities. Whereas once they would have sat in the center of communities, now they're designed for access, for ease of access by vehicle. So they sit in between the communities. And that means as a pedestrian, you're walking outside of your community to reach them. And often through areas like this one pictured here, which actually has a supermarket in relatively close, this is a better example, but through an area which is really not particularly inviting over several large roads. So it's a long way to places. But often also, because those really key facilities are outside of the communities, it's not just a long way to these facilities, it's also a long way through areas which lack passive surveillance. And by that I mean a sort of sense of community, windows looking out onto a street where you feel like you're visible, you're still within a community. Often pedestrians in Scotland trying to get to sensible places have to walk through areas like this where these are streets which are designed for motor vehicles. They're not part of a community. If you're here on your own after dark, you feel very isolated and at risk. So, Stuart, you said this was meant to be more optimistic. So to try to make this more optimistic, the good news here, these things can all be changed. Actually, these things are not technically too difficult to change. These things result from a vision of cities where everybody can get around really easily in cars, and where we're facilitating that over everything else. These are technical problems essentially, and we can change them. Streets can look different to how they look just now. If we want people to leave their cars at home or not to buy a car, we can make those changes, and we can make it much easier for people to walk around, and therefore much less of a need for them to have a car. So we've got what we've got because we built it that way, and we can actually rebuild things a different way. That's the good news. And I'm going to hand over to Anne at that point.
Thanks, Robert. Thank you very much. I will just try and share my screen now. And hopefully you can you see my slides? Can I get it to do a slideshow? There we go. Is that now showing?
We have the wrong window, and if you click the options, the display setting options at the top left of that screen.
I will do that. But I think I have to just stop share and start the share again. Apologies for that. Is that now?
That's it.
That's it. Okay, lovely. Sorry about that. So yes, thank you, Robert. As you say, and I have highlighted, we have opportunities now. And oh, my slides don't want to move on. Isn't that good? Let's see if I can get them to move. Having got I've not had that particular issue before when I've had the screen, but they won't move onto the. There we go. Maybe it's resume slideshow. That is an interesting.
And do you want me to share?
Yes, we do share them, Nancy. I don't know what my computer, fortunately, I have to say, thank you to my computer for choosing to crash during the break, but it completely crashed and froze and I had to stop it and start again. So the fact that I got back into the Zoom call was a good thing. But I think sharing the screen has just taken it a step too far. So apologies for that. So I'm starting off by simply saying, yes, as Robert has highlighted, now is a time where there is an opportunity for change, and we can make a difference. We've had commitments from COP26 for climate change. We've got the National Planning Framework 4, which is very much focusing on a modal shift, which means getting people out of their cars. And the 20-minute neighbourhood or 15-minute cities, there's many names, but the idea is it's all about living locally. We've got the COVID recovery agenda, trying to take the advantages and the benefits that we had during lockdown of quieter streets and the lessons learned from there, plus getting people confident to get out and about in their communities again, which also is reflected in an emphasis on the loneliness and community mental health needs that are about, and there's projects and monies to support that, as well as physical activity targets. So we have a real backdrop of issues and policies and strategies that all can help us get some real change. If we go to the next slide. If, however, you can feel a but coming on, then that's because, sorry, Stuart, there is a but. Because what we've been hearing this morning, and the photographs, the carousel showed it really well. Robert, you've highlighted the real nub of the issue. We've been building these streets for cars for so long. And what communities tell us is we just want pavements that we can walk on. Too often, the pavement, I think we heard it from Rod in Inverness when he with his guide dog, talking about a footpath that just ends and he has to cross the road because the footpath just comes to an end. It's very rarely, I mean, there are a few roads that end in a dead end, but you're usually signposted. It's very rarely you're driving along and have to stop because the road just peters out. You're not halfway along the M8 and then it just doesn't exist anymore. But that happens frequently for pedestrians. And again, what communities say, if you can't walk the whole route, you can't make the journey. And they also have told us very much that really nothing seems to change. This is not new, and this has been a long time in the planning. I was very struck by your phrase, Robert, that we've got the streets that we planned for. We've built it this way. We've got what we've built. So there does seem to be a disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality. Next slide, please. And when it comes to putting in extra things, new small changes of infrastructure that they can make a difference, there has been, from our learning and experience, a ridiculous number of challenges, frankly. We have a video if you want to find out more. All they wanted was a bench, which I think someone will put a link to in the chat, which tells the story of getting benches installed and why it was a particular challenge. And I think this is important because it highlights that there isn't a process for doing this across different local authority areas. It highlights what I was saying earlier, and that Jenny picked up on, that the different departments that need to be involved. It highlights that because there's no process, and more than that, it's not clear whose responsibility it is. And I think this is one of the big challenges. Often for the benches that you see here, a couple of the benches, the ones with the grass in the pictures, they were in one local authority area, and that was a real challenge, and it took real grit and determination for the community group to get those benches, and they really needed to have the support of a project behind them, bucket loads of determination, frankly, and stamina, because it took 18 months, 2 years to get their bench. And if the 20-minute neighbourhood framework is all about living locally, and people want to make this happen, then there needs to be that join up. We need to have bigger conversations, that every time you put in a bench, you don't have to go through a consultation as if you were doing a £10,000 project. A bench is not very expensive. A bench should be very straightforward to put in, but it really isn't. So we need to get that partnership between seeing what's important, and a bench is seen as an extra thing to have to do by some council departments, whereas for active travel, it's seen as part of making walking easier and creating pleasant walking environments. Pleasant walking environments is not on anybody. Nobody has a target for pleasant walking environments. There isn't a single local authority target to say what you've done to make a pleasant walking environment. I'd love to start there. So I think this really is a time of opportunity, but we really need to really want it. And if we really want it, we can make it happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. That is throwing down the challenge there in terms of how do we get from where we are now to where we need to be, where the policy says we should be. We've had the good policies for a number of years.
Yeah.
So I am going to now hand over to Susan Claris from Arup. As explained, has been a long-time supporter, contributor to the work of Living Streets, and has been talking about moving us to a walking world for a number of years. So I'm keen to get an update on how we take the next step. So over to you, Susan.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Can you see the slides and hear me okay, Stuart?
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you. So yeah, very happy to be here today. So thank you for the invitation. And as Stuart said, at Arup, we produced a document called Walking World 6 years ago, and I'll be drawing on that a bit. But to introduce myself, I'm a transport planner at Arup, and I'm also very happily Vice President of Living Streets. I'm a white woman in my mid-50s with sort of shoulder-length brown hair. Nothing remarkable about me, I'm afraid. I have neither dog nor child in a pushchair, but I do walk regularly, both to get to places. It's my main form of transport, but also, particularly while I've been working from home, my sort of fake commutes, get out for a walk in the morning and a walk at lunchtime. And yes, we've been talking about making a walking world. I did a publication 6 years on this, and I think a lot of the themes that are coming through today is we know what to do. We know the good things that need to happen, but actually, how do we make those fundamental changes? And that's what I want to talk about today. So I'd like to start off with some reflections of active travel at COP26, then sort of talk about the transport decarbonisation and the whole idea of avoid, shift, improve. Then talk about what I refer to as transport gluttony, which we've seen sadly a lot of in the photographs already, and I'll explain that. Some examples of the fact that it can be done, and then conclude with the guidance that we've just produced on walking for everyone. So if I start with active travel at COP, and I think it's really important to understand the outcomes of what we're trying to achieve when we talk about improving walking. And decarbonisation for me is a really important one. And we need to have a fundamental change in how we see walking's role to achieve decarbonisation. So the Transport Day at COP was on the 10th of November, and the presidency programme made it really clear what the focus was of COP for transport. Kickstart the mass market for zero emission vehicles. Transport Day will bring together leaders from across the sector to accelerate the transition to 100% zero emission vehicles. So it was very clear what the emphasis of the event was. There were, fortunately, some events on active travel, on walking, wheeling and cycling, but not that many. I had the great pleasure of chairing one called Cleaner, Quieter, Healthier, the Added Benefits of Transport Decarbonisation, which featured some really great speakers, Dame Sarah Story, Sir Patrick Vallance, Chris Boardman, Alison Irvine from Transport Scotland. I've put in a link to the YouTube video at the bottom there if anybody would like to watch it, but I'll pick out some quotes. That was the event. In the middle there is the Mayor of Utrecht speaking passionately about how people walking and cycling are the kings and the queens, and cars are the visitors in Utrecht. And just to highlight some of the smaller quotes there is, Sir Patrick Vallance talking about how the green choice needs to be the easy choice and how small changes can make a significant difference. Chris Boardman always speaks very passionately about the fact that we won't get out of the car unless we see out of the window. What we see out of the window looks good and looks inviting, and all the time it takes bravery to try and go to the shops, we'll keep running the kids to school in the car. Alison Irvine picked up on the behaviour change piece being just as important as infrastructure, but more challenging to deliver. And I think that's been a strong thread in some of the talks already today. Mayor Sharon from Utrecht, without public support, you are nowhere, and make pedestrians and cyclists kings of the road. I said the cars are just visitors. And Pete Zanzatera talking about creating places where people want to live. So again, we know a lot of this stuff, but it's how do we do it? There was another session with Liz Globe transforming street design. Again, I've put in the link to the YouTube video, but just to pick out some of the quotes from there. Leslie Kern saying, we mustn't allow sustainability plans to compete with or to supplant equity plans, but they need to inform each other. Janet Sands talking about democratising public space and fighting climate change go hand in hand. Carly Gilbert Patrick, if you could experience the city from the height of an average healthy 3-year-old, what would you change as a city leader? Really powerful way of trying to see our city through different eyes. The importance of public space being safe, and that should be a right. And then Anna Richardson from Glasgow at the time talking about how if we're going to tackle transport emissions quickly and effectively, we really need to look at improving active travel infrastructure, and we need to work at a pace. So lots of good words there. And I said in terms of what we should be doing, but how do we make it happen? And unfortunately, the policy paper that came out of COP26 was full again of moving towards zero emission vehicles, with just this final paragraph, almost slightly grudging, about support for active travel at the end of it. So it was very much seen as an afterthought in terms of the statement. So this is where I come to the avoid, shift, improve. This is the way that many people, myself included, think of transport in terms of decarbonisation. And this is where we start to bring in the priority for walking. And I think it really is about having that avoid, reducing the need to travel in the first place. Then shift, if travel cannot be avoided, then shift trips from car to walking to cycling and public transport. And then, if only then, you go to improve. So if trips cannot be made by sustainable modes, cannot be avoided, then minimise the impact of road traffic by improving it, such as electrification. But too often, certainly in terms of government policy, we go straight to the improve. We go straight to, well, we electrify the car fleet and it'll all be fine. But I think we need to have this pyramid that's shown on the right here in terms of reducing the need, walking in its most inclusive, walking and wheeling, then cycling, public transport, taxis, freight and servicing, and private vehicles need to go at the bottom. They are still important. They will still be important for some people, but it's a question of priorities. And there's nothing particularly new in this. At Arup, we produced a document about, you've declared a climate emergency, what are the next steps? And there again, we looked at the same thing. Top of the list has to be reducing the need to travel. And that's about creating communities. It's about having denser zones. It's about integrating spatial and transport considerations. Then it's about the shift, prioritizing sustainable transport. So creating conditions for increased uptake of active travel. And then at the bottom, minimizing the impacts of road traffic. So there you get into the cleaner vehicles. And I said that for me is really the first fundamental change. We need to look at our priorities differently, both in terms of carbonisation and generally, so that walking does come first. And part of all this is addressing what I refer to as transport gluttony. And I define this as the overconsumption of transport and also public space, critically to the detriment of others. And those other people will be people walking, wheeling and cycling. And here's a couple of photographs from my own road. I live in London. Increasingly large vehicles taking up public space, being parked for the majority of the time, taking up really valuable street space, which should be a public asset, and just make the streets, the use of these SUVs just makes the street more hostile. But it's not just cars. You see here an example of a couple of cycle hire bikes that have been just left casually on the pavement without thinking how they block the footway. And I said, it really is. This comes down to, unfortunately, it is a behaviour by a lot of us. Governments have a role, but people have a role as well in terms of their behaviour. We've seen, sadly, vehicles many photos of parked vehicles on the footway. This one on the left is I took on when I was out on one of my many walks and chased down the road for taking the photograph. So someone blocking the footway by having their vehicle overhanging from their own property, as well as being parked on the footway. And it's actions such as engine idling. And the graphic here from idling action shows how much pollution an idling engine can produce in a short period of time. And unfortunately, engine idling, there are already laws against it, but they're not enforced, and it's something we see all the time. And it just makes the street less attractive for walking. And then you've got what I refer to as the motoring mindset. So just a couple of adverts that pop up on Twitter for cars. And I said, again, it's easy to blame the car manufacturers, but they are producing the cars that people want to buy, unfortunately. The bizarre advert from Audi, let your heart beat faster in every aspect. And then this one from Mercedes-Benz USA, which was actually taken down after it was put up because there were so many complaints. But having a car with 5 screens, real-time eye tracking, it's just not a safe vehicle to drive. But I said, unfortunately, these do seem to be the sort of vehicles that people want. And if we look at how we travel, and there's some data here, this is from 2019, Transport and Travel in Scotland. You can see there in terms of the driver and car by car or van is the dominant. Walking is still about a quarter of all trips. It has been going down, and things have changed since 2019. But I said we can see there that walking is already, it is a significant mode of transport. And if we look at journeys under 2 miles and how we travel, you can see that, even for really short journeys under 2 miles by walking, but you still have a significant proportion undertaken by car and van. And similar for journeys under 5 miles by bicycle, you've got very low mode share, the majority of those being undertaken by car and van. So most of our trips are short, and many of them could be walked or cycled. And just to look at slightly more up-to-date data, this is Scottish transport statistics that have just been published for 2020, but said, fully appreciating that 2020 is not an average year by any means. But again, focusing on the fact that most journeys tended to be over short distances. So almost a quarter of all journeys are under 1 kilometre long, and then a further 28% between 1 and 3 kilometres. So you've got half of all journeys are short, below 3 kilometres. The average journey distance, 2.8 kilometres. So many, again, these journeys could be walked and cycled, but the difficulty is that if you have a car, you're most likely to use it for that very short journey. And that's what makes the walking environment hostile, less attractive for people. And really just to flag up as well that it isn't just personal travel. One thing we've seen a huge change on, certainly in London, but I'm sure it's the case elsewhere, is the amount of small goods that are delivered. I'm not talking here about the weekly supermarket shop or big bulk buys, but people having their lunch delivered, their breakfast delivered, a small bag of groceries delivered. And I found it astonishing. So Gorillas, one of the main companies, the most commonly ordered products are bottled water. And, you know, if people are actually ordering bottled water, and I see it all the time in the street where I live, and I've got a corner shop at both ends, and I see my neighbours who you know, are fully fit and able, they're able to get out and about. It's just easier to have things delivered. And unfortunately, when they're delivered, most of the time they're coming on a moped, sometimes they're coming in a car, sometimes they come on a cycle. But I said it's a lot of this comes down to our own behaviour as well. And always conscious at events like this is, you know, we are a bit of an echo chamber. We're talking here to the people who are interested in walking and who probably have similar views. The difficulty is the people who have no interest in these events, and it's not even on their radar, and how we change behaviour. So really, in terms of fundamental changes, it's how do we change things to get the priorities we need for transport decarbonisation? And then also, how do we move beyond people thinking that just driving an electric vehicle is enough? I wanted to give some positives in terms of showing that it can be done. So I've just got a few examples here that hopefully might prompt some thoughts. And the first one is the work that we've done at Arup in Dundee for doing active travel audits, building on from what Robert said in the previous talk. And this is really going out and seeing what is there, doing the desktop review, virtual site visits, stakeholder engagement, and then having an action plan so you have a final report with recommendations, in this case for strategic citywide active travel interventions, as well as more targeted suggestions. And I did see the comment in the chat that we spend too much time doing audits and we should just be out there doing stuff. And well, I do have every sympathy for that view, but I think it is important to know what's there in order to be able to prioritise, in order to be able to actually make informed decisions, because otherwise the danger is it could be quite piecemeal, but happy to talk more about that in the panel. And then we also did an active and sustainable travel action plan for Montefiore, for the town there. And this was really focusing on what the barriers are. So what are the everyday barriers to travelling actively and sustainably through the town? And again, using this information to form an action plan to focus towards local behaviour change initiatives. So it's very important to have that, you know, from the bottom upwards in terms of looking at what the barriers are. Some active travel master plans that were done for the Inner Moray Firth. And looked at various towns there and the improvements that can be made to make them better for walking and wheeling and cycling for everybody. And then I really wanted to flag that I think a lot of the actions to improve walkability can come from many levels. I'm a massive fan of parklets, getting rid of one parking and putting in some greenery and some seating, as we've heard about. And I said this, you know, this can be at the scale of just one parking space. The image I've got here is for Bold Street in Liverpool, where it was done over a whole street. But picking up on the, you know, what about rural areas? What about smaller communities? Just changing one parking space can make a difference. It's not always easy to do, but it can be at that scale. Also, active travel projects can come from other directions. One of my favourite projects that we've worked on is in Greener Grangetown in Cardiff, and that actually started off as a integrated sustainable urban drainage scheme. So it was really putting in things like rain gardens, but then it was like, if we're doing this, what can be done elsewhere? Things like the audits can come in really handy, because if you have a project that's being done for other means, you can say, well, actually, if we're doing this for drainage or if we're doing this for lighting, what else can we do at the same time? And then these things can actually work together to add benefit. And there was a community co-design approach to this. And I said the idea was to encourage more walking and cycling, while actually at the same time creating streets that are more resilient, they're greener and they're more attractive. Active travel schemes can come from connecting communities. An example of a community greenway in Belfast And this was 16 kilometres of cycle and walkways, again, water theme to it with improved flood protection and a linear park. And this was looking at community cohesion, economic development, improving public health, having cleaner rivers and having greater flood resilience. And then one of my favourite ones is the city of Pontevedra in Spain. We often quote the Netherlands, but Pontevedra in Spain, it has a population of 83,000. And the reason I like it is because the changes there, which were to absolutely put walking first, have been in for over 20 years now. During that time, we've seen the number of traffic fatalities come down, carbon emissions come down, trips transfer, and crucially, while other towns in the region have shrunk, central Pontevedra has gained new inhabitants. And also, really importantly, the mayor has been re-elected for a 6th time. So it shows that these measures are really popular and get support. And then the final, which might seem a bit of a wild card one, was Folkestone down in Kent. This is a new skate park that's opening next week. And the quote there from the article was, "We originally asked to design a multi-storey car park, but when a nearby skate park had to be relocated, we were asked to incorporate it in the design. The client increasingly thought the cars looked boring, so we got rid of them and made the world's first multi-storey skate park instead." And this is really just about the culture of a place. So I think for me, actually choosing not to have a multi-storey car park in the centre of the town, but to have a facility that promotes activity, skating, there's a climbing wall, just helps to actually change the whole culture. To finish, so this is the sort of the third fundamental change I want to talk about. Talked about decarbonisation, talked about transport gluttony. The third one is really making sure that walking is for everyone. And just in the last couple of minutes, I want to just give a brief overview of the publication that we launched last week at the Living Streets Walking Summit in London. This really has 2 main aims: is how do we ensure everyone has a genuine choice to walk, and how do we feel that people feel comfortable and welcome while doing so, and how we can better prioritise marginalised groups when improving walking to help reduce wider social inequity. And the footnote there is just on walking and wheeling, using it in the most inclusive way. So the report is out. There's a link on the previous slide to the report. The process we went through for doing this was to have rapid literature reviews, to have individual interviews, to have a workshop to bring the solutions together. And I said the guidance was launched last week, and we had great help from the organisations there listed in the purple box. And the 3 lots of recommendations come under improving governance, planning and decision making. I won't go through them all because I want to finish on time, but I said the slides will be available. But it's really important that first of all, we look at having improvements, I said, to the very top level of planning and decision making. That it is about creating better places for everybody to walk and to wheel, picking up on many of the issues we've heard today about, for example, ensuring pavement space is reserved and maintained for people walking and wheeling. And then the third one about supporting everyone to walk and wheel. So it is about raising the profile, it's investing in walking and wheeling programs, it's prioritising children's needs, and it's closing the disability mobility gap. So for me, I said it's those 3 fundamental changes. We need to focus on the avoid rather than the improve. We need to tackle transport gluttony, and we need to make sure that walking is for everybody. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Susan. That was excellent. I think it was an excellent overview, and we're getting to the positive bit as well, which is great. Please stay with us. We're going to move to some questions right at the end. I've hopefully got Sheila Duffy with us now, and it's timely that you hear, Sheila, because I have been asked a question in the chat that this audience only talks to itself, and that we need to talk to others. And I think you've been down that route in terms of the whole movement on smoking cessation. So I'm keen to see what we can learn from ASH Scotland's experiences over 20 years. I should say, when we were putting together this agenda, we were looking for big societal shifts. And the ones we came up with were LGBT rights and the change in smoking in Scotland. And we're struggling a little bit up beyond this, so we're really pleased to hear about what you did, how it worked, and what we can learn from it. So I'll hand over to you, but I'm going to start with one question. Have you won?
We've had definite wins, but I would say we haven't won yet, and we are still working on very important issues like smoking prevention and tackling the inequalities gap that there is in communities in tobacco use in Scotland. Okay,
in terms of the progress you've made, the science has always been there on smoking since the 1950s, and there was a lot of common sense, and we see this with active travel. It says if you walk and cycle more, you're healthier, you reduce it's all there, but it doesn't seem to cut through. How did you actually win these kind of skeptical audiences over that just didn't want to understand the facts?
So my experience is that it can take 5 or 6 years to put things on the agenda. And during that time, although it may seem obvious to you in your discussions, you have to keep raising it in public awareness and with policy makers and influencers. In our case, we understood the science that tobacco smoke was toxic, but we had to talk to politicians, policymakers, health charities about that science to raise interest. And then it was really when it became an issue for the public and communities that we were able to raise the profile and raise the arguments. And that became really an issue of comfort, in that many people were raising that they did not feel comfortable eating in the presence of tobacco smoke. So the debate for us began with a sort of noise of discomfort that was reaching policymakers, elected representatives, and allowed us then to have the conversations about it isn't really a comfort issue, it is an issue of health, and it's an issue that can be solved. It's not a necessary problem, it doesn't have to continue.
Great. And when you're making those arguments, you're obviously up against a big lobby that's all persuasive, advertising, lifestyle, the lot, and I do reference a paper that was produced from some public health professionals, including some from Scotland, called "Are Cars the New Tobacco?" How do you overcome that just sheer cultural persuasion that's going out there through the various channels they have?
So Ash Scotland, we are formally opposed to the tobacco industry because its products are harmful and because its methods are to do with misleading, to do with public affairs, to do with trying to discredit the opposition with the aim of maintaining profit at the expense of consumers. And I think our learning has been to watch the arguments, to challenge misinformation, and to try to resist the framing that places the argument as being about people who smoke versus people who don't smoke. But in reality, the argument is about a toxic consumer substance that is heavily advertised against people, whether they smoke, used to smoke, or have never smoked.
I think that's a really useful point that maybe you could expand on. I think we are increasingly seeing it's pedestrians and cyclists versus drivers, and particularly it's drivers on low incomes that are going to get hit by this, so we can't do anything about the people on high incomes who drive the most. And yeah, how did you overcome that idea that you were certain people were being stigmatized in all this debate or being targeted because of their lifestyles? The old guy that just wants to go down to the local boozer and have a fag at the bar, why shouldn't he be allowed to do that? I remember these arguments at the time. How did you get around that sort of side of things?
I think for me, we had to keep the argument focused on the issue. And the issue was toxic tobacco smoke. And we had to point out that the industry was blaming people rather than allowing change. And it was getting in the way of change and actively undermining attempts to regulate these toxic substances.
In terms of how important was positive case studies in all of this? Were you able to sort of sell this to the public, the great leap forward of smoke-free places?
Well, in our case, it was not so much individual stories as the example of Ireland introducing workplace smoke-free laws first. And then the politicians saw that it was popular and that it could work here because Ireland was like Scotland. And with plain packaging for tobacco, similarly, Australia went first with that measure. And then we were able to explain why the evidence showed it would make a difference and put it forward in Scotland. But I would say for the media and for politicians, individual human stories count way more than statistics. And if you can tell a story that explains what you're trying to argue for, you are much more likely, I think, to get traction with that story. So to give you one example, cigarettes are often felt to be stress relief, but in reality, they harm mental well-being, and people who have quit smoking or have never smoked have better mental well-being. And we shared a story of someone who had decided to quit smoking and who was so empowered by that experience and by the improvements in her mental well-being that she went on to make other changes in her life and left an abusive relationship. And that was a powerful story because she spoke about the impacts in her life of making that change and how she felt so much better and improved her life through making it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something we do need to get better at as the sector in terms of case studies, and you know that finding those powerful examples. You've also probably used a lot more behaviour change models in terms of how you targeted things, and maybe you could talk a little bit about who you targeted and how you thought about them in the behaviour change sense, rather than the classic "it's very, very scary, don't smoke, you're going to die," from a much more holistic approach to people's actual lives and how they lead them and getting them to change those lifestyles.
So for me, this has to come from two directions: from individual choice and decision and motivation up, and from societal context, creating environments that promote health and support healthy choices down. So in terms of smoking and tobacco, we need to hear from the voices of those who have successfully changed that in their lives, and also to amplify the voices that don't get heard, because over 2/3 of smokers wish they weren't. So the industry will amplify the right to smoke, but it will never talk about the impacts on that person's life and the lives of the people around them. Most smokers don't want their children to smoke, and that is a powerful argument in itself. If they had the choice again, they wouldn't smoke because of the health risks, because of the cost. But I think we also have to press decision makers to make those healthier choices the easier choices. And that's the case for tobacco and e-cigarettes, for unhealthy food and drink, for alcohol, for so many other things. We need to create supportive environments for people to choose what they actually deep down want to choose as is best for them.
It's great. I'm going to move on to sort of slightly contentious. It's a difficult subject for the active travel sector, and it's maybe there's parallels for you as well. We are grappling with the idea of e-cars, electric vehicles. It's the answer. You know, the problem solved. People can do what they want without the pollution. You've obviously got e-cigarettes out there which are being heavily promoted. They're on every high street now, and they're becoming quite pervasive. You see quite a lot of people. What's your sort of stance on those, and what lessons would you have for us as a sector?
E-cigarettes have been contentious and difficult in terms of discussion, but for me there are three elements. One is, if they are less harmful than smoked cigarettes and people can transfer completely onto e-cigarettes, that would be a good thing, but it's a minority of smokers. If they use both, there is no harm benefit, no harm reduction benefit. I think we have to look to the next generation, because e-cigarettes are heavily promoted, and they have flavors, colors, design that really have youth appeal. And we see young people taking them up who are not taking up smoking. So we have to look to the future and how commercial interests position them. And with e-cigarettes, what we've seen is it started off as a kind of grassroots movement with people importing equipment and liquids mainly from China. But when it gained recognition, the big multinational corporations who are motivated by profit muscled in on the market and took it over. And they have the resource to exclude the smaller independent producers. So I think we have to look at short-term gains and harms, longer-term gains and harms, the whole population effect, where does this take us, and the commercial interests who have manipulated how these are presented and perceived.
That's good. Yeah, no, that's really important for us, I think, and it's a good point. Is there any sort of final points you would like to give us in terms of the journey you've been on in terms of public health? Actually, I have another question. Have from where you started from and all the predictions that were made about the health benefits, have they been realised and recognised?
In terms of smoke-free public places, yes, very definitely. And the government put in a research programme that proved the benefits, and that encouraged other countries to follow suit. Again, plain packaging, very resisted by industry, but it has shown benefits. It's shown that it's continued the downward trend of youth smoking. I think our current battle is novel products like e-cigarettes. And, you know, it's easy to look back and say it was obvious that cigarettes were harmful, but when you're in the thick of the debate, you don't always see the obvious, I think. So I suppose my final piece of advice then would be, make sure that you have strong partnerships and common interests. And that might be with different groups. It might be with environmental groups, with ability-focused groups, with people concerned about age at either end of the spectrum, with planners and transport planners, and see if you can develop shared messages that you are all using, and see if you can set a goal for what would be the next wins, what is achievable. And I think you know, if you look at those who influence decisions, you've got council elections coming up. You could all contact your electoral candidates and say, this is an issue, what would you do about it? Just amplify that concern and make sure that it's on the agenda.
Excellent, thank you for that. If you're happy to stay with us, I'm going to open up some questions and bring back Susan as well. I need to sort of work my way through the chat, but and I'm going to ask Living Street's colleagues if they see anything in the chat that would be worth reading out or raising. That would be helpful as well. I've got a very specific question for Susan, actually. Susan, can you speculate on why engine idling is not enforced by most local authorities? What are the practicalities of enforcement and what's the e.g. minimum observation period and stuff? And that's from, I think, John Berry from Dundee.
Great, thanks for that question. Unfortunately, it is only speculation, but there was a Freedom of Information request recently. This was for London, that showed that only 1 in every 1,000 drivers who were reported for engine idling were fined. And the specific example given was in Westminster, where I think over a 3-year period, 70,000 drivers were reported to the council for engine idling. And of those 70,000 drivers, only 63 fines were issued, and then only half of those fines were paid. I think the fines are £80. Why it's not is the harder one, whether it is council priorities, whether it's lack of resources. But I said, unfortunately, I think it's one of those cases where there is legislation, but it just isn't enforced. It will be good to see councils taking more action. I don't know if anyone's got any experience of the enforcement in Scotland. I can put a link in. I'll put a link in the chat to the article of the Freedom of Information. But it's a real shame where I said you have a law, but it's just not enforced.
Quick question for Sheila on the back of that. How much enforcement is needed, required in terms of smoking legislation these days?
Well, it's interesting because in Scotland we have a register, and to be able to sell tobacco e-cigarettes you must be registered, which means that enforcement officers can see on the register who they need to speak to. Now, Trading Standards has the right to take court cases and fines against people for breaking the law on selling tobacco, but in practice local authorities feel it is expensive and time-consuming and tend not to do it. But what has been helpful is giving Trading Standards enforcement officers the right to issue spot fines if they perceive that the law is being breached.
Okay, I've got a question for Susan, and in terms of how do you see streets shaping up in terms of balancing removal of vehicles, creating space for pedestrians, but also making sure those spaces meet the needs of everyone? And that's from Michael Torno, who some people won't know, but Michael's picture was in some of our presentations. He kindly lent some images there from a shoot we did a few years ago, walking streets of Glasgow. So yeah, how close are we to getting this right, Susan?
I think, as we've seen in most of the images, we're a long way from it. And I think for me, it's important to think of streets as something that evolve. You know, most of the streets, many of the streets that we have were pre the car. And it's the fact that the car has come along and dominated those streets. And it's now about taking it back or taking it forward to a situation where the car isn't so dominant. And I know, see, there have been comments in the chat as well, the amount of space on our streets that is taken up by parked vehicles. You know, there's nowhere else where you would take public space and use it for private storage of something, but it's something that we've come to accept. And I think this is a big part of the behaviour change. People assume that when they live in a house, it's their right to park outside it. And actually, you know, if you can take most of the parked cars away, some residents, particularly people with disabilities, will still need a car. I accept that. But if you can get rid of a lot of the cars and then free up the space for wider footways, for greenery, and just rethink the design, but rethinking that design has to be inclusive, as I mentioned in the Walking for Everyone. So, you know, the real danger in this is that we design in our own image. And that's why you end up with many of the streets looking the way that they are, and that is through we need a more inclusive process to take on board the needs of everybody. But I said, for me, a massive first step would be to actually reduce the amount of on-street parking, even more so when it's parking on the footway, and actually use that public space for the public.
Okay, I've got a great question from Rachel Hazel. And it's toxic tobacco smoke is the villain in the story. What is the villain in promoting active travel? It shouldn't be drivers or cars. So I'll leave that to you to ponder. Who would like to take that one first?
I'm happy to. I mean, for me, it is the transport gluttony, which doesn't have to be cars, but is largely cars. And I said it is those. It's the large vehicles. It's the behaviours we've talked about. And I said it isn't just. And this is where I think there's a good parallel to smoking. It isn't just the act in itself. Is that it makes the streets hostile for other people. That it isn't a situation that there's no knock-on impact for other people. And I said, unfortunately, while you have those behaviours and have those vehicles, and it's people who want those vehicles. We see that in SUV sales. You know, people want to buy these types of vehicles. Why is beyond me. I wouldn't want to pay tens of thousands of pounds for a massive vehicle that I'd probably be terrified to drive due to the size of it. But I'm probably not a typical demographic in this. But yeah, so for me, the villain is unfortunately the transport gluttony that we see. It is the vehicles and it's the behaviours in driving those vehicles, which for the large part, almost exclusively, I think, have no place on most of our streets. Yeah,
Sheila, do you have any reflections on how you portrayed the opponents to this? And,
I wouldn't presume to define the villains in your area of expertise, but you might want to look at particular campaigns and where the opposition sits. So I think Susan's picked out the image mongering by car sales companies and car manufacturers. I think it's about balancing rights as well, you know, because there was a lot of debate about the right to smoke, but no one argued for the right to breathe. So coming up with practical solutions that are embedded in communities for me is quite important.
Yeah, I like that idea about the right to breathe, which is also the right to move and breathe clean air at the same time. So we're maybe onto something there. I'm just trying to pick out questions.
There's a couple of specific questions in the Q&A bit, I think, Stuart.
Yeah, I'll go back. I've got one from Colin Young who's been very active in the chat. So I'm going to ask about. He's talked about how do we get cars off streets when there's families who may or may not, but definitely feel that they require to travel by car. And they want to park outside their door, and that is part of what they do. How do we reach those audiences? Is there a way of getting a message to them?
I think it is tricky. I mean, I've done over the years in my transport planning work, I've done a lot of consultation on parking strategies. And it's the thing that people feel most powerfully about. And unfortunately, we have got the culture where people seem to think that if they buy a vehicle, it's the local authority's responsibility to find them somewhere to park it. You know, they have a right to park on street. They say they pay road tax. You know, and unfortunately, these arguments don't apply, but it's what people are used to. And I think it's always much harder to take something away from people rather than not give it to them in the first place. But I think a lot of it is around the conversation. So, you know, talk about the improvements that can be made to streets, how people would like their children to travel or their parents to travel, or they want to travel themselves, rather than actually taking away a parking space, which is always seen as the negative. So I think it's trying to use positive language where possible, but also recognizing how strongly people feel about their vehicles. And I think the model of car ownership is just, it predicates against people walking and cycling. I said, because once people have bought a vehicle, the fixed costs of motoring are so high, the marginal costs are so low. Once they've bought it, they will use it as much as possible to justify the purchase of it. So, you know, car clubs and shared car ownership is something that in the majority of places just doesn't seem to have worked. I'll be interested in Sheila's view on this, because for me, it makes absolute sense. Why else would you pay tens of thousands of pounds for something that you use on average for maybe an hour a day? And we see this in terms of average vehicle miles. You know, the average car now does something like 8,000 miles a year. If you take last year, not a typical year, or 2020, it will be even lower. So we're buying more and more of these vehicles, and we're using them less, which just doesn't seem to make sense to me. But that's what people's behaviour is. So it's a really difficult one. But I think where possible, use positive language: the right to breathe, the right to be, children's safety, safer streets, healthier streets. I know it won't convince everybody, but as soon as you start talking about taking something away, removing a parking space, that's when the motoring hackles rise.
So I think from my experience, absolutely use the positive language. There are levers of change, and with tobacco, the most effective one is price. And someone's pointed that out in the chat, that higher fuel costs may make people think. I think spending little and often, you don't actually realise how much it costs. So buying 10 as was cigarettes a day or 20 cigarettes a day, you know, you might be spending £10 every day, but you don't think that over the course of a year that adds up to a couple of thousand, which equates to a holiday or whatever, you know. So I think actually be explicit about the costs directly to the people using the vehicles. And I think you cannot go too far too fast. You have to take people with you. So it might be that you start lobbying for certain areas to be free of vehicles, and there to be parking beyond. And you ask people as a consideration to that community, for all these positive reasons, to only come and drop off shopping or pick up people or whatever, unless they have a blue badge, and to park just a little way out as part of that community moving towards something that is better for everyone.
If I could just add to that, I mean, certainly that was the experience in Freiburg in Germany, where they started having the car-free streets, and they just, to begin with, they just introduced it on one street where there was support. And then once people saw what that street was like, the neighbouring street said, I want some of that. And it made its way out that way. Whereas if you try and do something over a large scale at the beginning, you will get opposition. So building on those pockets of support, so that then people actually see the benefits, they see the positives of a great place where children can play, where people can be, where people can sit, and they start to see it in that way, as opposed to, where am I going to park my car?
I think showing it's possible is important, because with smoking, people said you can't have a pub without smoking. But then they discovered, you know, that they could walk between pubs and smoke, that it wasn't necessary. And the only complaints were you got more midges coming into the pub in the Highlands, and you smelt people's bodily odour more. But it was worth it for the improvements to bar workers' health.
Yeah, I sort of recall it came in about a year earlier in Scotland than in England, and in that year I was down south about 2006, and I walked into a pub and I was shocked. I was just like, what's going, you know, the social norm had shifted. I just couldn't believe that people, this environment, I just don't want to be here. You know, it had been an environment I'd been in for years as a student and just tolerated it, and then you suddenly see that shift. And I think that's right. We need the examples of where we just don't have enough of them. I think that's a point. And there's only so far we can take examples from abroad. And I think it was interesting what you said about Ireland. I think that was probably useful. That was Ireland, that you can relate to Ireland possibly. So maybe we need Ireland to go really, really hard on pedestrians, and we can steal all their ideas, or maybe we could do it and they would copy us. So I'm going to start closing things down now, just as a wrap up. So thank you, Sheila, for giving up your time. I was really, really appreciate you coming along this morning, and really, really useful. And thank you, Susan, again for your contribution. I think there's some slides that you can put up, Nancy, that just allow me to close things. Yeah. So here's some final thoughts, and it's just going back to what we heard about. A lot of these are the known issues. I think they're all changeable and fixable. So if you take anything away, what can you do for pedestrians? I think we're not particularly good at asking for stuff the way that cyclists have very defined asks and have been very good at. But we do need to tackle parking issues. Street clutter is something that can be sorted out, and I would refer to some of the footage we used was actually quite old of Mike, and he was navigating A-boards in Edinburgh, and they're actually gone. The council have got rid of them, although they're creeping back a little bit through lockdown. So that can be dealt with, and that would be an easy win. And crossings, yeah, we just need to put them where people need them, and that's about asking communities. Nobody's going to oppose crossings, and I think they need to be owned by the communities, not by the engineers. And shorter crossing times is so easy to do, and there's no reason not to do that. I think we need to move on that. And Robert made a lot of points about inaccessible pavement and pavement edges, and we do need to just get those standards in place and start making that the norm. Careless driving, I think this is getting tolerated in a way that it shouldn't be tolerated. These are not victimless crimes. At some stage, somebody gets hurt. We need to recognize that, and there's a lot of collateral damage from driving that we just tolerate, and we shouldn't. And I think that's one of the things about one of the benefits of the reduction of smoking. The fire service isn't as busy as it used to be, and we need the ambulance service not to be as busy, picking people up off streets that have been hit by cars. Let's get pruning. It shouldn't be for people with sight difficulties to carry their own secateurs. That's not something that in a civilized society that should be happening. And there are certain times in the year when we know that it's a good time to get out there and prune. And really, we should have done it already because the birds are nesting now. But we've got the autumn to look forward to get the shears out. And yeah, we know where there's not pavements, and we just should provide pavements. That's really important. I would start with schools on that. I have a few other things. Can we have the next? Is it a further slide? Yeah, this is an interesting picture, which some people might recognise where it is, and it's got a tenuous active travel connection, which I'll tell you about. This is actually a cousin of my wife getting married just at the end of lockdown in a church where we all had to wear masks, and it was great to get outside and get some photos done. And unfortunately, it was on George IV Bridge in Edinburgh, which is normally a really, really busy street, and you wouldn't actually normally have been able to do this picture, but because there was spaces for everyone scheme there, there was a lot less traffic, and it was possible to take this picture in the middle of the road. So there's a nice happy memory, sort of brought to you by spaces for everyone, because it does get a bad rap, but in that instance it made it. And it does make you think, how many streets would you actually be able to take a group of people out to and take a nice photo in the middle of? And it shouldn't take a pandemic to create these spaces. We should just have these spaces. So that's just a lasting thought, to think about streets as the wedding test. That's a new way about how we should do things. We had just a very quick summary of what we heard about. I think we've heard about the purpose of doing this stuff, and that's well understood. We actually have the policy, and increasingly we actually have some pounds to actually do this stuff. Where I think the next challenge is the processes. How do we actually get projects on the ground? And the important part that we touched on with Sheila was, how do we take people with us in a time of change, given the level of change that is needed? So we hope to continue those debates with you. And if you are available this afternoon, there is still a few opportunities to come and join us on the walks. We're not fully subscribed. We are departing from Stirling Station at 2 p.m. and we'll have a walk around the Riverside area, and that will be with my colleague Graham and our associate Becky Cox. And we will also be doing a walk around in Edinburgh, departing Waverley Bridge at 2 p.m. So do please join. I'll be on that one with Robert Weetman, and we'll see some good stuff and we'll see some bad stuff on these walks, but we'll have a great chat along the way. So it's all about just getting to get together with us. I hope that you've saw the polls. There's one last poll we've got up, which I'm going to just ask. And that, do you think that the policies and projects are in place that will mean more people will be walking and fewer people driving for short distance in 5 years' time? And there's a little bit of skepticism. Everybody's saying yes, mostly, to some extent. So there's some positivity at 60%, and there's some people still to be convinced. So we still have work to do, I think. So we'll hopefully continue these conversations. Before we finish up, I would like to thank all the speakers and panelists that joined us this morning. You've all been fantastic and given us great contributions. I'd like to thank all the people that have helped us with accessibility in the background. Some people won't have noticed how hard they've been working, but they have been working away all morning. I'm going to give them the thumbs up because they'll give the thumbs up back to me. So that's Tara, Heather, who were doing the captioning, and Vicky and Bruce on BSL. I have to give a massive thank you to Nancy Gregg, who pulled the whole thing together, made the whole thing possible, battled with the technology and got us through that. So thank you, Nancy, and yes, do show your face there. You've been in the background and made this happen. There was a vision of how this should work, and I think we just about delivered it despite the gremlins. So thank you, Nancy. I thank Transport Scotland, who support our work, and this is part of that work, is delivering these types of events. And the final thank you is for everybody that has joined us this morning. Your time is incredibly precious, and it's a real honour that you've given us to us this morning to discuss these issues. Hopefully we will see you in person. Hopefully we can make things a little bit more interactive in the future as we get through the pandemic. So that's to look forward to. So thank you once again to everybody involved, and we will continue this debate, and we will hopefully continue seeing improvements in our streets and sharing them with you. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.